Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The prairie wind in central Texas has a voice of its own. It's a low, constant whisper that sweeps across vast open country, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain. In the early months of 1993, that wind moved around a collection of simple, almost haphazardly constructed wooden buildings, 10 miles down a lonely dirt road. This place was a hive of activity, a world unto itself. It was called Mount Carmel, and to the 100 or so people who lived there, it was the only world that mattered. It was a place of deep, resonant faith, of shared meals and rousing music, of children's laughter echoing in the wide-open spaces. It was a place where a man named David Koresh, their prophet and teacher, was deciphering the final cryptic secrets of God. They believed they were living at the very precipice of history, that the end of days was not a distant prophecy, but an imminent and glorious event they were chosen to witness. On the morning of Sunday, February 28th, the wind carried a different sound. It started as a faint thrumming, a rhythmic beat that grew steadily louder, deeper, more menacing. It was the sound of helicopters, low and fast, shattering the Sunday morning peace. From inside the main building, faces turned towards the windows. The thrumming was joined by the rumble of engines on the ground, the sound of heavy vehicles approaching at speed. Confusion rippled through the community. Was this it? Was this the prophesied confrontation with Babylon, the corrupt outside world they had been taught to fear? For the federal agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms assembling outside, this was not the apocalypse. It was the execution of a search warrant, codenamed Operation Showtime. They believed the compound was an illegal arsenal, that the man inside was a dangerous charlatan, and that they were there to enforce the law. Within minutes, the prairie wind would carry the sharp crack of gunfire. It would carry the shouts of panic and the cries of the wounded, and it would fan the first sparks of a conflict that would mesmerize and horrify a nation. The standoff at Mount Carmel would last for 51 agonizing days, a slow-motion disaster played out on live television. It was a siege that pitted tactical teams against true believers, psychological warfare against apocalyptic faith. It was a tragedy born from a cascade of miscalculations, a profound failure to understand the people on the other side of the wall. How did a legal warrant for firearms devolve into a battle? How did a community of believers become entrenched in a deadly standoff against the full might of the U.S. government? And how did it all end in a towering inferno that claimed the lives of 76 people, including more than 20 children? Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a standoff. We will examine the volatile chemistry of faith, fear, and firepower that ignited on that Texas prairie. We will trace the path from a routine investigation to a botched raid, through weeks of tense and surreal negotiations, to the final catastrophic assault. We will explore how two opposing worlds, each utterly convinced of its own righteousness, collided with a force that would leave behind little more than ashes, and a legacy of questions that still haunt us to this day. To understand what happened at Waco, you must first understand the man who stood at its center. He was not born David Koresh. He was born Vernon Wayne Howell on August 17, 1959, in Houston, Texas, to a teenage mother. His childhood was a study in instability and loneliness. He never knew his father. He was raised primarily by his grandparents, and by his own account, it was a deeply unhappy upbringing. He suffered from severe dyslexia, which made him a poor student, a target for ridicule. He was a lonely, awkward boy who found solace in two things: the Bible, which his grandmother helped him memorize, and the electric guitar, which he taught himself to play with remarkable talent. These two passions, scripture and rock and roll, would become the twin pillars of his future identity. By his late teens, Vernon Howell was a high school dropout with a restless energy. He was charismatic in his own way, a gifted speaker who could quote scripture chapter and verse, weaving complex biblical interpretations with a street-smart confidence. He drifted, played in bands, worked odd jobs, and searched for a place to belong. He found it in 1981 when he joined a small, obscure religious community living outside Waco, the Branch Davidians. The Davidians were an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, a splinter group that had been awaiting the imminent return of Jesus Christ for decades. They were led by an aging prophetess named Lois Roden. In this small, isolated community, Vernon Howell's encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible finally found a captive audience. He was seen as a prodigy, a brilliant student of Scripture. His ambition, however, was far greater than being a mere student. He began an affair with the much older Lois Roden, who saw him as her spiritual successor. This put him in direct conflict with her son, George Roden, the heir apparent. The power struggle that ensued was bitter and bizarre. It culminated in a 1987 incident where Howell and a group of his followers, clad in camouflage and armed with rifles, stormed the Mount Carmel property in an attempt to oust Roden. A gunfight erupted. No one was killed, but Howell and his followers were arrested and tried for attempted murder. The trial ended in a hung jury for most, and an acquittal for Howell. In the eyes of his followers, this was a sign of divine protection, with Roden eventually institutionalized for a separate, unrelated crime. Vernon Howell had won. He was now the undisputed leader of the Branch Davidians. Once in control, he began to transform the group's theology and his own identity in a radical way. He legally changed his name to David Koresh. David, for the biblical King David, from whom he claimed descent, and Koresh, the Hebrew name for Cyrus the Great, the Persian king who freed the Jews from Babylon. He taught his followers that he was not merely a prophet, but something more. He was the Lamb of God, the final Messiah, the only one who could unlock the secrets of the 7 seals from the book of Revelation. He taught a doctrine he called the New Light, which held that as the perfect Lamb, he had to take on the sins of the world. This had a very specific practical application. He was to father a new lineage of God's children. He dissolved the marriages of his followers and took their wives and daughters as his own spiritual brides, some of them shockingly young. He was the only man permitted to have sexual relationships within the compound. He was building a house of David, and these children would one day rule the world with him. Life at Mount Carmel under Koresh was a paradox. It was communal and structured, with long, often rambling Bible study sessions that could last for hours. Led by Koresh himself, usually with a guitar in hand, they renovated the compound, built a watchtower, and stockpiled food and supplies, preparing for the apocalypse they believed was at their doorstep. They ran several small businesses to support themselves, including selling firearms at gun shows. This was a key activity, both for income and for arming their community for the final confrontation with Babylon. But alongside the communal faith and music, there were allegations of a much darker reality. Former members spoke of strict, authoritarian control, of grueling physical labor, harsh discipline for children, and the psychological and sexual abuse inherent in Koresh's New Light doctrine. It was a closed world, deeply suspicious of outsiders, held together by the magnetic force of one man's absolute certainty. The outside world, or Babylon, as Koresh called it, began to take notice in 1992. The catalyst was a series of seemingly innocuous events. A local UPS driver reported that packages being delivered to the rural compound were suspiciously heavy, leaking gunpowder, and sometimes contained inert grenades. This tip found its way to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF. The agency began a quiet investigation. They suspected the Branch Davidians were illegally modifying semi-automatic rifles, such as Arkansas 15S, into fully automatic machine guns, a serious federal offense. They also suspected the group was stockpiling illegal destructive devices, like grenades. The ATF placed the compound under surveillance. They sent an undercover agent, Robert Rodriguez, to infiltrate the group. Posing as a student interested in Koresh's teachings, Rodriguez managed to get inside Mount Carmel. He confirmed the presence of a large number of weapons and heard Koresh's apocalyptic, often violent rhetoric firsthand. Rodriguez reported that Koresh preached about a coming fiery ordeal and a violent confrontation with the government. He heard talk of the mighty men, a select group of followers trained for combat. Based on Rodriguez's reports and other intelligence, the ATF built a case. They compiled a detailed affidavit and, on February 25, 1993, secured a federal search warrant for the compound and an arrest warrant for David Koresh. Now came the critical decision: how to serve the warrant. The standard procedure for a case like this might have been to arrest Koresh when he was away from the compound, perhaps during one of his frequent trips into Waco. This would have been safer and less confrontational. However, the ATF leadership rejected this approach. They argued that Koresh rarely left the compound, and when he did, he was always with armed guards. They feared that if they arrested him alone, his followers back at Mount Carmel would destroy the evidence of illegal weapons. They became convinced that the only way to secure the evidence and ensure the safety of their agents was with a dynamic entry, a surprise large-scale raid. The plan was ambitious and complex, given the name Operation Showtime. Nearly 80 agents would be involved. They would arrive in 2 large cattle trailers, disguised to look like local ranch vehicles, to get close to the compound without raising alarm. They would be supported by 3 helicopters from the Texas National Guard, which were supposed to create a diversion on the opposite side of the compound, drawing the Davidians' attention away while the ground teams moved in. The strategy was built entirely on the element of surprise. The ATF believed they could quickly overwhelm the occupants, secure the building, and seize the weapons before any organized resistance could form. It was a plan that left very little room for error. Tragically, the element of surprise was the first thing to be lost. In the days leading up to the raid, a series of catastrophic leaks and blunders ensured that David Koresh and the Branch Davidians knew the government was coming. The ATF's plan, which they had tried to keep secret, was an open secret in parts of the Waco media. A local newspaper was already working on an exposé series about Koresh called The Sinful Messiah. Someone tipped off the press about the impending raid. On the morning of February 28th, just as the ATF convoys were getting into position, a local television cameraman from station KWTX, who had also been tipped off, got lost trying to find the compound. He stopped and asked a man for directions. That man was a Davidian who happened to be a postal worker. He immediately recognized the man as media, grew suspicious, and drove straight back to Mount Carmel to warn Koresh. At almost the same moment, the undercover agent, Robert Rodriguez, was inside the compound. Koresh approached him, his demeanor changed. He said, "Neither the ATF nor the National Guard are coming, are they, Robert?" It was a chilling moment. Rodriguez knew his cover was blown. Koresh let him leave, and as he departed, Koresh told him that a shootout was coming. Rodriguez frantically tried to contact his superiors to call off the raid. He told them, "They know we're coming, they know." But his warnings were either not received in time or were disregarded by commanders who felt the operation was too far along to abort. The cattle trailers were already rolling down the long dirt road to Mount Carmel. The helicopters were already in the air. Operation Showtime was going forward, but its premise, surprise, had completely evaporated. The raid was no longer a raid. It was an assault on a fortified position that was armed, alerted, and expecting a fight. The two white cattle trailers rumbled down the dusty driveway toward the main building of Mount Carmel, a sprawling multi-story structure that looked more like a makeshift fortress than a home. Inside the trailers, nearly 80 ATF agents, clad in tactical gear, checked their weapons one last time. They were tense, but they were trained for this. The plan was to swarm the building from all sides, breach the doors, and secure the premises before the occupants could react. But as the trailers came to a stop and the ramps slammed down, the agents were met not with confusion, but with an eerie, calculated silence. David Koresh himself appeared at the double front doors. He was unarmed, his expression calm. ATF agents approaching the door shouted, "Police, get down." According to the agents, Koresh simply smiled, said something to the effect of, "What's going on?" and then retreated back inside, closing the door behind him. Seconds later, the silence was shattered. A hail of gunfire erupted from dozens of windows and firing ports built into the walls of the compound. The initial volley was overwhelming. Agents were hit before they had even taken more than a few steps from the trailers. The tactical plan dissolved into chaos. Two teams of agents assigned to breach the building's flanks were pinned down by heavy, accurate fire and couldn't even reach the walls. Another team, assigned to provide cover from a small structure nearby, was also immediately suppressed. A crucial part of the plan involved a team of agents climbing onto the roof of the main building to secure the upper floors and Koresh's personal quarters. They managed to get ladders up and scramble onto the low, flat roof, but they were completely exposed. Gunfire erupted through the very roof beneath their feet. They were trapped with no cover, taking fire from below. One agent was shot and fell through a hole in the roof into the building, where he was killed. Other agents on the roof were hit, their colleagues desperately trying to provide first aid while also returning fire. The battle had become a desperate struggle for survival. The supposed diversion by the National Guard helicopters had failed. Instead of drawing attention away from the main assault, they drew fire themselves and were forced to pull back. The agents on the ground were now engaged in a ferocious gunfight with an enemy they largely couldn't see. The Davidians were firing from prepared positions inside their home, a building they knew intimately. The ATF had intelligence that the group possessed around 48 weapons. In reality, they possessed over 300, including dozens of assault rifles, and several .50 caliber rifles, powerful enough to tear through the agents' vehicles and body armor. Inside the compound, the Davidians' perspective was one of defending their home and their families from an unprovoked military-style assault. Years of Koresh's preaching had prepared them for this exact moment. This was Babylon, coming to destroy God's chosen people. They believed they were fighting a holy war. Wayne Martin, a Harvard-educated lawyer and one of Koresh's top lieutenants, managed to get through to the 911 emergency line. The recorded call is a chilling document of the chaos. Martin is heard pleading with the dispatcher, There are 75 men around our building, and they're shooting at us. They're shooting at us. He begs for a ceasefire, insisting there are women and children inside. The dispatcher, clearly confused, tries to understand who is shooting. The sound of heavy gunfire is constant in the background. The firefight raged for nearly 2 hours. The ATF agents were outgunned and in terrible positions. They had sustained heavy casualties. Agent Conway Leblew, Agent Todd McKeehan, Agent Robert Williams, and Agent Stephen Willis were killed. At least 16 other agents were wounded. Inside the compound, the Davidians also suffered losses. Koresh himself was wounded, shot in the wrist and side. At least 5 Branch Davidians were killed by ATF gunfire, including a 2-year-old child, though the circumstances of her death remain disputed. Eventually, a local sheriff's department helped broker a ceasefire to allow the ATF to retrieve their dead and wounded. The battered and bloodied agents withdrew, leaving the bodies of their fallen comrades behind temporarily. The raid had been an unmitigated disaster. Operation Showtime was over. The siege had begun. As the ATF fell back, a new authority arrived on the scene. The Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI took command of the situation, transforming the area around Mount Carmel into what was effectively a military encampment. Hundreds of agents, tactical specialists from the elite hostage rescue team, HRT, and support personnel descended on Waco. The perimeter was secured, and the 51-day standoff that would grip the nation began. The lead figures for the FBI were Jeff Jamar, the special agent in charge of the San Antonio office, who became the overall on-site commander, and Byron Sage, a veteran and highly respected negotiator. Their initial strategy was one of negotiation, based on the assumption that this was a barricaded hostage situation. In the first few days, there was a glimmer of hope for a peaceful resolution. Negotiators established phone contact with David Koresh and others inside the compound. Byron Sage, in particular, spent hours on the phone with Koresh, trying to build a rapport. Koresh, for his part, used the phone line as a pulpit. He delivered long, rambling sermons, explaining his intricate interpretations of the 7 seals. To the FBI, it was nonsensical religious babble. To Koresh and his followers, it was the divine word, the very reason for their existence. The negotiators tried to focus on practicalities, on the release of the people inside, especially the children. Koresh agreed to release some children in exchange for having his religious messages broadcast on the radio. A 58-minute sermon was played, and 19 children were allowed to walk out of the compound. But this early progress soon stalled. The FBI saw the releases as a sign of successful negotiation. Koresh likely saw them as a way of getting non-essential personnel out of a coming battleground, or perhaps as a test of the FBI's intentions. He made more promises. He said God had told him to write down his interpretation of the 7 seals, and once this manuscript was complete, he and all his followers would come out peacefully. The FBI waited. But Koresh was a master of delay and manipulation. Days turned into weeks. He would set deadlines for surrender, and then claim God had given him a new instruction. The FBI's patience began to wear thin. Simultaneously, while negotiators like Sage were attempting to build trust, the FBI's tactical side, the HRT, began to apply escalating pressure. This dual strategy, negotiation on one hand, intimidation on the other, created a deeply contradictory message. Armored vehicles, including M60 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, were brought in and began circling the compound, crushing the Davidians' cars and property. They cut the electricity and water to the building. And in one of the siege's most infamous tactics, they began using psychological warfare. Giant loudspeakers were set up, and for hours on end, they blasted the compound with a bizarre and tormenting cacophony of sounds. Tibetan chants, Nancy Sinatra songs, the screeching of rabbits being slaughtered, and piercing high-frequency noises. The intended effect was to induce sleep deprivation and psychological distress, to break the will of the people inside and make them want to surrender. The actual effect was arguably the opposite. To the Branch Davidians, who were already steeped in an apocalyptic worldview, this was not psychological warfare, it was the fulfillment of prophecy. Koresh had preached that Babylon would come with its armies and torment God's people. Now, here were tanks, helicopters, and agents of the government, besieging their home and torturing them with demonic sounds. Every act of tactical pressure by the FBI did not break their faith. It profoundly reinforced it. It proved that Koresh was right all along. The outside world really was evil, and their only salvation was to stay with him inside Mount Carmel. Throughout the siege, a total of 35 people did leave the compound, but more than 90 remained inside. The FBI struggled to understand their mindset. Were they hostages, or were they willing participants in Koresh's apocalyptic drama? The answer was complex. The people inside were true believers. They had given up their former lives, their families, and their possessions to follow Koresh. Their entire reality was framed by his teachings. While they may have been free to walk out the door, to do so would have meant abandoning their faith, their community, and what they believed was their only path to salvation. They were not hostages in the traditional sense. They were captives of a belief system that the FBI seemed either unable or unwilling to comprehend. As March turned into April, a sense of stalemate and deep frustration settled over the siege. Within the FBI and at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., the debate over strategy intensified. The negotiators, led by Byron Sage, argued for patience. They believed that time was on their side, that the Davidians would eventually come out if they continued to talk. The tactical commanders from the HRT, however, argued that negotiations had failed. They saw Koresh as a manipulator who would never surrender peacefully. They pointed to deteriorating sanitary conditions inside the compound and, most critically, to ongoing allegations of child abuse as justification for a more aggressive, decisive action to end the standoff. The final decision fell to the newly appointed Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno. She was presented with the two opposing viewpoints. The tactical commanders proposed a plan. They would use modified M60A1 combat engineering vehicles, which were essentially tanks fitted with booms, to punch holes in the compound's walls. Through these holes, they would pump in CS gas, a potent form of tear gas. The gas was not meant to be lethal. It was intended to create an environment so unbearably uncomfortable that it would force everyone inside to evacuate the building and surrender. The HRT assured Reno that the plan was designed to save lives by preventing a mass suicide, which they increasingly feared Koresh was planning. They downplayed the risks of a fire, stating that CS gas was not flammable and that fire trucks would be standing by. Reno was deeply troubled by the reports of children being subjected to poor conditions and potential abuse. After days of briefings and deliberation, she gave the green light. On April 18th, the Davidians were given a final ultimatum to surrender. It was refused. The decision was made to execute the tear gas plan the following morning, On April 19, 1993, the 51st day of the siege, that date, April 19th, held a grim historical significance in America, marking the anniversary of the first shots of the American Revolution at Lexington and Concord. For the Branch Davidians, it would become the date of their own personal apocalypse. Just before dawn on April 19th, the prairie was once again filled with the rumble of heavy engines. The plan began to unfold. 2 large combat engineering vehicles, or CEVs, lumbered toward the main building. These were not traditional tanks with cannons, but rather engineering vehicles designed to clear obstacles. One was nicknamed the Wrecker, fitted with a battering ram. The other had a long boom with a nozzle for injecting the gas. Over loudspeakers, the FBI announced their intentions. "This is not an assault. We are not entering your compound. We are inserting tear gas. This is to get you to come out." The CEVs began their work methodically. They drove up to the building and used their rams and booms to punch large holes in the wooden walls, systematically breaking down the Davidians' defenses and creating entry points for the gas. Then the injection began. Projectiles containing CS gas were fired into the building, and the gas was pumped in through the boom nozzles. The Davidians had been anticipating some kind of attack and had gas masks, but the sheer volume of the gas was overwhelming. It is a powerful irritant, causing a severe burning sensation in the eyes, nose, and throat, difficulty breathing, and disorientation. The FBI's plan was to saturate the building, level by level, forcing the occupants out into the open air where they could be arrested. For hours, the assault continued. The CEVs created more and more holes, pumping in vast quantities of gas, yet almost no one came out. The FBI's assumption that the Davidians would flee the gas proved to be wrong. Instead, audio surveillance from bugs planted near the compound months earlier picked up the sounds of people gathering, moving deeper into the structure. They retreated to a central concrete-walled room, a former vault near the center of the building, where they huddled together, men, women, and children, trying to wait out the chemical assault. The surveillance also picked up snippets of conversation. David Koresh was heard giving what sounded like a final sermon. Other voices were heard discussing the gas, their masks, and, most chillingly, pouring fuel. Then, just after 12 o'clock noon, it happened. A small wisp of smoke was seen coming from a window on the second floor, then another, from a different part of the building. Within moments, flames erupted, seemingly from multiple points at once. The fire spread with terrifying speed. The building, constructed mostly of wood and plywood, and insulated with flammable materials like cardboard and hay bales, acted like a tinderbox. The strong, gusty prairie winds that had been blowing all morning whipped the flames into a frenzy. In less than 10 minutes, the entire structure was a raging inferno, a colossal pyre sending a column of thick black smoke billowing into the Texas sky. Panic and chaos ensued outside. The fire trucks that were supposed to be standing by were held back, initially because of the fear that they would be shot at by the Davidians. By the time they were cleared to approach, it was far, far too late. The compound was completely engulfed. The intense heat caused ammunition stored inside to cook off, creating the sound of a continuous firefight. The structure began to collapse in on itself. The world watched horrified on live television as the home of the Branch Davidians was reduced to a smoking ruin. Only 9 people managed to escape the fire. They emerged from the flames, burned and dazed, and were immediately taken into custody. Everyone else, 76 people, including David Koresh and 25 children, perished inside. Many were found huddled together in the concrete bunker, where they had not been burned, but had died from smoke inhalation or carbon monoxide poisoning, as the fire consumed all the oxygen. Some had gunshot wounds, which the government later argued were evidence of mercy killings or suicide as part of a preconceived. In the immediate aftermath, the question that burned almost as intensely as the fire itself was, who started it? The FBI and the Justice Department were adamant. Their infrared aerial footage, they said, showed flashes of light inside the building just before the main blaze, consistent with someone igniting a fire. Their audio surveillance had captured Davidians discussing spreading fuel and lighting fires. The evidence, they concluded, pointed overwhelmingly to a deliberate act of mass suicide orchestrated by David Koresh. This was the tragic, but inevitable, conclusion to a standoff with a dangerous cult leader. But that narrative was immediately and forcefully challenged. Survivors, defense attorneys, and a growing number of critics offered a different, more disturbing possibility. They argued that the FBI had started the fire, either accidentally or deliberately. They pointed to the CEVs, which had been smashing into the building for hours. Could they have knocked over a propane tank or a kerosene lantern? They focused on the CS gas itself, while the FBI insisted it was not flammable. Critics produced evidence that the chemical agent, when dispersed as an aerosol, could be combustible, especially when introduced into an environment with a potential ignition source. The most explosive theory revolved around the use of pyrotechnic gas projectiles, which are fired from a grenade launcher and are known to be a fire hazard. The FBI vehemently denied using any pyrotechnic devices on April 19th. However, years later, during subsequent investigations, they were forced to admit that a handful of military-style pyrotechnic gas grenades had in fact been. This admission, long withheld, shattered the government's credibility and fueled conspiracy theories for years to come. The tragedy of Waco did not end with the fire. The surviving Branch Davidians were put on trial, not for murder, but for charges related to the deaths of the 4 ATF agents during the initial raid. Several were convicted and sent to prison. For decades, the government's handling of the siege was the subject of intense scrutiny, including congressional hearings that became bitterly partisan. A special counsel was appointed and an independent investigation was commissioned. The official conclusions largely exonerated the government of wrongdoing in starting the fire, reaffirming the belief that the Davidians had committed mass suicide. But these findings did little to quell the public's deep-seated suspicion and distrust. To many, Waco was not just a tragedy, it was a massacre, a terrifying example of government overreach and incompetence. The anatomy of this standoff is a case study in catastrophic failure. It was a failure of intelligence, beginning with the ATF's blindness to the fact that their raid had been compromised. It was a failure of tactics, from the ill-conceived dynamic entry to the counterproductive psychological warfare that only strengthened the resolve of the people inside. But most profoundly, it was a failure of understanding. The FBI approached Mount Carmel as a secular law enforcement problem, a barricaded subject with hostages. They saw David Koresh as a common criminal, a con man holding people against their will. They failed to grasp that they were not dealing with criminals, but with believers. The Branch Davidians saw the world through a biblical lens of prophecy and persecution. To them, the siege was not a negotiation, it was Armageddon. Every action taken by the FBI, intended to pressure and persuade, was interpreted by the Davidians through this apocalyptic filter, confirming Koresh's prophecies and making a violent end, not just possible, but inevitable. The legacy of Waco is long and dark. The image of the Mount Carmel Center burning to the ground became a potent symbol for the burgeoning anti-government militia movement of the 1990s. It was seen as proof that the federal government was a tyrannical force willing to murder its own citizens. A young Army veteran named Timothy McVeigh visited the site during the siege. He was so enraged by what he saw as government-sponsored murder that, exactly 2 years to the day after the Waco fire, on April 19, 1995, he detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Mora Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. He chose the date deliberately, as an act of revenge. The ashes of Waco, it turned out, contained the seeds of an even greater tragedy. Today, nothing remains of the Mount Carmel Center but a concrete foundation, a swimming pool filled with stagnant water, and a small chapel built by a new group of Branch Davidians. The famous Texas wind still blows across the empty fields, but it no longer carries the sounds of music or children's laughter. It whispers through the stone markers that bear the names of the dead, the agents and the believers, the adults and the children. It is a memorial to a tragedy born from a fatal collision of two separate realities, a place where absolute faith met absolute force, and where the smoke of certainty choked out any hope for common ground. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.